Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. Exactly the wrong age to be the kind of broke that has a momentum to it, a gravity, a compounding interest that follows you from month to month like a very patient creditor. Which, of course, it was. The debt had accumulated the way most catastrophic things accumulate in real life, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long, slow series of small poor decisions layered over a structural disadvantage I had never fully named or understood. My father had died when I was 19, leaving behind a modest house in a mid-sized city and a set of financial obligations my mother was not equipped to navigate. I was the older of two children. My sister, Petra, was 16 at the time and still in school. I made the decision, and it felt like a noble decision when I made it, which is how a lot of decisions that later destroy you tend to feel, to defer my own plans and take up responsibility for the family finances. I got a job in a logistics company, a reasonable salary for a 20-year-old with no degree, and I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would go back to school. I told myself that once Petra was through university and on her feet, I would have my turn. You can already see what happened, I imagine. Not because it is unusual. Because it is almost unbearably common. Petra finished university. She married at 25. She moved across the country for her husband's career, and that was fine, that was genuinely fine. I held no resentment toward her then and hold none now. But by the time she was launched into her own life, I had been in the same logistics company for 9 years, had taken on a small business loan to try to start a courier side business that failed in its second year, had accumulated credit card debt to cover the gap that the failed business left, and had developed a relationship with a woman named Corinne that lasted 4 years and ended largely because, as she put it during our final conversation, she could never quite tell who she was talking to. I have thought about that phrase a great deal. I could never quite tell who she was talking to. At the time I heard it as an accusation. Later I understood it as a description. An accurate one. I was, by 28, someone who had spent a decade being useful to others at the cost of being legible to himself. I had no particular sense of what I enjoyed. I had no clear picture of what I believed, politically, spiritually, personally. I had a set of roles I played, the responsible son, the reliable coworker, the easygoing friend who never made a fuss, and I played them competently, with a quiet professionalism that people appreciated in a general, non-specific way. But underneath the roles, there was something I had never looked at directly. Not because it was frightening, exactly. More because I had never been given an environment in which looking was an option. The debt, the responsibility, the constant low-grade crisis of working-class financial management, all of it created a kind of forward-facing pressure that made self-examination feel like a luxury I simply could not afford. The debt, at its worst, was approximately $64,000, the business loan, 2 credit cards, a personal loan I had taken out to help my mother after a health crisis, and several months of arrears on the apartment I was renting after she passed. My mother died when I was 26, quietly, from a cardiac event that the doctors said had been building for years, and that loss, the loss of her, hit me in ways I was not prepared for and did not process well or quickly. I worked more. I ate poorly. I drank more than I should have for about a year, not dramatically, not in the way people describe when they are trying to explain an addiction, but in the way people describe when they are trying to explain a long, slow leak. A glass most evenings became 2. 2 became a bottle. I stopped that eventually, not because of a crisis, but because one morning I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time, and I mean a genuinely long time, several minutes, and felt, with a clarity that surprised me, that I was standing in front of a stranger. Not a frightening stranger. Not an enemy. Just someone I had never formally met. I stopped drinking that week, gradually. I started walking in the mornings. I did not call it recovery, because that word felt both too large and too clinical for what it was, which was simply a small quiet decision to reorient towards something, even if I did not yet know what that something was. The meeting with Vivian Orchard happened 5 months after that morning in the bathroom. It happened, as consequential things sometimes do, through an entirely mundane channel. I was working an evening shift at a high-end catering company. I had taken the second job to try to make progress on the debt, and the event was a fundraiser for an arts organization that I had never heard of, held in a marble-floored building in the wealthiest district of the city. I had been circulating with a tray of champagne flutes for approximately 2 hours when I accidentally, and I use that word with full awareness of how thin the membrane between accident and fate actually is, overheard a conversation that I was not meant to hear. That asked as much as it gave. She had been married twice and widowed once. She had no children of her own, though she described herself as having produced several through the medium of patronage. She was, in every meaningful sense of the phrase, a person of substance. We spoke for 40 minutes at the end of that evening, in a small anteroom off the main hall. She asked me questions about myself with the focused attention of someone conducting an interview, and I answered honestly, which surprised me. By the end of the conversation she had established the following: that I had significant debt, that I was underemployed relative to my actual intelligence, that I was emotionally isolated in ways I had clearly not fully acknowledged, that I had no particular attachment to the life I was currently living, and that I was, and this was the word she used, carefully, precisely, unformed. Not undeveloped, she said. Unformed. That is a different thing entirely. Undeveloped suggests potential not yet reached. Unformed suggests that the essential shape of who you are has not yet been decided. That is, in the right circumstances, an extraordinary advantage. I was not sure whether I had just been complimented or assessed. Possibly both. She offered me what she called an arrangement, which she said she would put in writing if I agreed to hear the full terms before responding. The terms were these: I would come to live in her household for a period of 1 year. During that year, she would pay off my debt in full and provide me with a living allowance. In return, I would function as what she described as her social ward, accompanying her to events, assisting with foundation work, and participating fully in the project of reinvention. The reinvention was the crucial term. She wanted me to participate in her social world not as myself, not as a young man from a working-class background with calloused hands and no formal education, but as someone new. Specifically, as a young woman. Not permanently, she was careful to say. Not surgically. Not in any way that I was not freely and fully willing to inhabit. But for the purposes of this world, this year, this particular social experiment she was conducting, as a woman. I am aware that this sounds, described in the bare terms I am using, like something from a novel. Something stylized and implausible. But I want you to understand the texture of how it actually felt in that moment, sitting across from a stranger in a borrowed anteroom with a tray of empty champagne flutes beside me and $64,000 of debt pressing on my chest. It did not feel like a novel. It felt like an extremely specific and almost clinical proposition, delivered by someone who was watching my face with the kind of attention that does not permit theatrical response. I did not feel manipulated, though I have since examined that feeling carefully many times for signs of manipulation I might have missed. What I felt was something closer to recognition. Not recognition of her. Recognition of the question she was asking me, the question behind the arrangement, the deeper question that all its practical terms were constructed around. She was asking whether I was willing to try on a different way of being, not as performance, not as costume, but as a genuine experiment in selfhood conducted in high-stakes, high-visibility conditions. She was asking whether I was willing to give up the person I had assembled, the useful, invisible, uncomplaining person I had become, in order to discover whether there was someone else underneath. I said I needed a week to think about it. She said she would expect my answer by the following Thursday. She gave me a card with a telephone number and a simple engraved font. Then she stood, and offered her hand, and said, "Whatever you decide, I hope you understand that the question I am asking you tonight is one you will need to answer eventually, regardless of whether you answer it with me." I walked home that night. It was about 4 miles. I walked the whole way. The week I spent thinking was the most concentrated period of honest self-examination I had engaged in up to that point in my life. I am not using the word honest loosely or for effect. I mean that I sat with myself, in the mornings before work, in the evenings after, walking, sitting on the bench in the park near my apartment where I had begun my post-drinking walking habit, and I tried to look at things clearly. The debt was real and it was crushing, but I knew that financial relief alone was not the reason I was considering the offer. If it had been purely financial, I would have felt relief at the prospect. I felt, instead, a kind of terrified electricity, the way you feel standing at the edge of something high, where fear and exhilaration are chemically almost identical and only the context distinguishes them. I thought about the mirror moment from months earlier. The stranger looking back at me. I thought about what Corinne had said. I could never quite tell who I was talking to, and I thought about the fact that I had never, in 28 years, spent serious time asking myself who I actually was, what I actually wanted, what I actually believed. Mockery and not secondhand embarrassment, but something more complex, something that lived in the neighborhood of recognition and longing, though I would not have had the vocabulary for either of those words at the time. I remembered being 18 and spending an afternoon with a female cousin who was preparing for a formal event, and how the ritual of it, the care and attention she brought to the process of getting ready, the intentionality of it, the way she was clearly thinking about who she wanted to present herself as, not just how she wanted to look, had struck me as profoundly interesting in a way I immediately dismissed as none of my business. I remembered, at 24, going through a period of reading about gender studies for reasons I had told myself were purely intellectual and emerging from those months of reading with a feeling I had actively avoided examining. Not a conclusion. Just a feeling. A warmth at the edges of certain ideas, a kind of leaning toward, that I pressed back down and covered over and did not revisit. The drawer was open now. I did not know what to do with its contents. But I knew, by the end of that week, that saying no to Vivian's offer would not close the drawer again. It would just mean dealing with the contents alone, in debt, in the pressing 3 a.m. silence, without any of the structure or support or challenge that her proposition represented. I called her on Wednesday, a day early. I said yes. The first month in Vivian's household was, and I want to use this word with complete accuracy, disorienting. Not in a distressing way, or not primarily in a distressing way, but in the way that all genuine reorientation is disorienting, when the coordinates by which you have been navigating turn out to be anchored to something that is no longer where you placed it. I had expected the practical challenges to be the primary source of difficulty. The physical transformation, the clothes, the hair, the learned mannerisms, the voice work, the deportment, all of that, I assumed, would be the hard part. It was not the hard part, or not the hardest part. The hard part was something I had not anticipated. The hard part was discovering, within the first 2 weeks, that I was not as uncomfortable in this new presentation as I had braced myself to be. Vivian's approach to the transformation was not theatrical. She was not interested in makeovers or dramatic reveals or any of the vocabulary of superficial change. She had brought in, over the first week, 3 consultants, a stylist who worked specifically with clients navigating professional presentations, a voice coach who had worked with actors and also with transgender individuals exploring their vocal range, and a woman named Dr. Adiz Okafor, who was a psychologist specializing in identity and life transitions. Dr. Okafor, I would come to understand, was the most important of the 3. The sessions with her, twice weekly, then as needed, became the structural backbone of the entire year. They were not therapy in the conventional sense, though they had that quality at times. They were more like a sustained, disciplined inquiry, in which she asked questions and I was expected to answer them with as much honesty as I could locate. The stylist's name was Marcus. He was a compact man of about 40 with an extraordinary eye for proportion and a manner that was both professional and completely without condescension. He looked at me on the first morning, really looked, the way that people in visual professions do, with an assessing gaze that is not unkind but is also not social, and said, "I am not trying to make you into someone else. I am trying to find the visual language that makes your actual self legible." I thought about that for a long time. The visual language that makes your actual self legible. It implied that the self already existed and simply needed better translation. I was not sure I believed that yet, but I was willing to consider it. The voice work was, practically speaking, the most technically demanding part of those early weeks. The coach, a woman named Sylvie, was patient in the methodical, non-coddling way of someone who has taught difficult skills for a long time. She worked not on gender per se but on presence, on breath, on resonance, on the relationship between what you feel internally and how that feeling moves through your body and into sound. She told me that the voice reveals what the face conceals, and that the goal was not to learn to speak differently but to learn to speak more fully. I practiced for 2 hours every morning, and slowly, very slowly, something shifted. Not the voice exactly. The relationship to the voice. There is an inherent vulnerability in speaking, in sending something of yourself out into a room and allowing it to be received or rejected, and I had spent years managing that vulnerability by keeping my register low, my volume moderate, my contributions brief. I was not a silent person. I could engage in conversation when required, but I was a carefully rationed one, always measuring how much of myself to put into a sentence, always keeping something back. The voice work began to dismantle that habit, and it dismantled it in a way that surprised me, because it had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with permission. I had not given myself permission to take up sonic space. Sylvie gave me exercises that were less about how to sound and more about how to allow myself to be heard. Said, from behind me, the first question is not whether you like it. The first question is whether it frightens you. It does, I said. Good, she said. Fear is information. The specific shape of what frightens you tells you more about yourself than almost anything else. Now, why does it frighten you? And that was the nature of the year. Every moment of discomfort was interrogated. Every moment of unexpected ease was interrogated. The interrogation was not punishing, it was not designed to force me into any particular conclusion, but it was relentless, and it was honest. And it was conducted in an environment of such rigorous expectation that there was nowhere to retreat into the comfortable vagueness I had spent years cultivating. The social events began in the third week. Vivian introduced me, across her circle of acquaintances and colleagues, as her ward and protégé, and she used she and her pronouns for me without ceremony, as though the introduction required no explanation. In those early events I was acutely, almost painfully aware of every moment, every glance, every exchange. I was afraid of being seen through, which is of course a different fear from being seen. I was afraid that someone would look at me and understand that the presentation was not complete, that there were seams showing, that the performance was visible as a performance. And the extraordinary thing, the thing I spent many weeks trying to understand, was that no one looked. Not in the way I feared. People engaged with me as Vivian had introduced me, with the specific and very particular social courtesy of the class she moved in which the surface agreement to the presented identity is not naivete but an elaborate and carefully maintained mutual fiction that makes social life possible. But something more interesting than that was also happening. Some of them were genuinely engaging with me, with who I was in that room, that evening, that presentation, and the person they were engaging with was responding. I was having conversations that were substantive, direct, curious, emotionally present. I was asking questions and listening to the answers with an attention I had rarely brought to social situations before. I was, in a word, engaging. Not performing engagement. Actually engaging. And the reason, I slowly understood, was that the persona, the new name, the new presentation, the new context, had removed something. It had removed the accumulated armor of identity, the careful management of how I was perceived as the specific person with the specific history and the specific weight of expectation that followed that person around. Whoever I was in that room, that evening, no one knew her history. She had no debt. She had no disappointed career trajectory. She had no mother who died at 48 or a relationship that ended because she was illegible. She had only the present moment and the conversation in front of her. I want to be careful again here, because what I am describing could sound like escape, like dissociation, like the appeal of running away from yourself into a different costume, and I think that interpretation is worth examining rather than dismissing. But I do not think that is what was happening, or at least not entirely. Because the person who was having those conversations, the person who was being present and direct and genuinely curious, was not a different person. The thoughts were my thoughts. The feelings were my feelings. The attention and curiosity were capacities I had always had. They were just, somehow, released by the context into a kind of expression that they had never been given before. Dr. Okafor, in one of our early sessions, offered me a frame that I have returned to many times since. She said that identity is not a fixed object that we possess, but a set of capacities that we develop in response to the conditions of our lives. The conditions of my life, she said, had required me to develop certain capacities: endurance, self-effacement, practical competence, emotional stoicism, and had not required, or had actively discouraged, the development of others' visibility, self-expression, emotional range, the capacity to be seen and to allow that seeing to be pleasurable rather than dangerous. She was not saying that the conditions of my life had made me a woman, or that the presentation I was inhabiting was the truest expression of some essential inner self that had been suppressed. She was more careful than that, more rigorous. She was saying that identity is a living process, not a discovery, and that what I was doing, even in its strange and unconventional form, was participating in my own formation in a way I had never previously been permitted. I held that frame carefully. I examined it for comforting dishonesty and did not find any. It felt true. By the end of the second month I had developed a name for the persona that felt organic rather than assigned. The name was Lena. It was not a name anyone had given me or suggested. It arrived during a walk in Vivian's garden early one morning, when the city was still quiet and the light was doing that particular thing it does in early autumn where everything is sharp-edged and slightly amber. And I was thinking about nothing in particular and the name simply appeared, the way the right words sometimes. She had spent her 20s and 30s dismantling that performance and replacing it with something of her own construction, and the foundation she had built, the cultural work, the patronage, the insistence on funding artists and thinkers and makers who operated outside the expected aesthetic, was the direct expression of that dismantling. She understood, from the inside, what it meant to spend years being someone you had not chosen to be. She was not projecting her experience onto me. I want to be clear about that. She was not trying to make me into a version of herself or to use me as a proxy for working out her own unresolved material. What she was doing, I think, was recognizing in me something she had once recognized in herself, the shape of an identity that had not yet had the conditions in which to form, and offering, with remarkable generosity and with very clear terms, the conditions. By month 4 I had begun to understand something that I think is perhaps the most important thing this year taught me, and it is this: the experience of inhabiting a different identity is, fundamentally, an experience of empathy. Not empathy as an abstraction or an intellectual principle, but empathy as something metabolic, something you develop in your body through experience and practice. Every time I navigated a social situation as Lena, every time I received a certain kind of glance from a stranger, every time a conversation took a particular turn, every time I was spoken to in a specific way, every time I had to manage the gap between how I was being perceived and how I was actually experiencing the moment, I was accumulating knowledge that I could not have acquired any other way. Knowledge about the specific texture of being in the world as someone whose social identity is constructed around a different set of assumptions than the ones I had been accustomed to. This knowledge was sometimes uncomfortable. It was sometimes revelatory. It was never abstract. There is a specific and persistent phenomenon that I noticed in the 4th and 5th months that I need to describe carefully, because I think it is one of the most genuinely educational aspects of the whole experience, and one that I believe has lasting value that goes far beyond my personal situation. In the social circles I was moving in, among the wealthy and the well-connected and the culturally powerful, there existed a very sophisticated and very carefully maintained set of dynamics that operated differently depending on how you were perceived. The same intelligence that received one kind of response when I engaged from a male presentation received a different kind of response from a female one. The same directness that registered as confidence in one registered as something else, not always negatively, but differently, loaded with different implications, in another. The same emotional honesty that had been coded as oversharing in my previous life was received, in this context and this presentation, as a kind of relational gift. I am not saying that one experience was better than the other. I am saying that experiencing both, from the inside, within the same year, within the same person, gave me a kind of double exposure of social reality that has permanently changed the way I understand what social reality actually is. It is not objective. It is not neutral. It is constructed, constantly, by the aggregate of perceptions and expectations that other people bring to an encounter. And those perceptions and expectations are attached to the visible presentation of identity in ways that are so deeply habituated as to be almost invisible until you have the experience of moving across the line. I thought about Petra, my sister. I thought about the women I had worked alongside in service jobs, and how their experience of those jobs, the same tasks, had a different quality than mine, a different set of navigational demands, a different relationship to the authority of the client. I thought about things I had witnessed and not thought very hard about, things I had filed away in that drawer and quietly stopped thinking about. The drawer was open. Its contents were no longer abstract. In the 5th month something happened that I had not anticipated and that threw me, for a period of approximately 3 weeks, into a state of internal conflict that was the most difficult of the entire year. Vivian's foundation hosted a weekend retreat for a group of young women she had been mentoring through an arts program. There were 12 of them, ranging in age from 20 to 27, and they were extraordinary, talented, ambitious, funny, vulnerable, self-aware in ways that the best young people are self-aware, which is inconsistently but genuinely. They arrived knowing me as Lena, Vivian's ward, and over the course of the weekend we talked and ate and walked and talked more, and something happened in those conversations that I was not prepared for. I connected with them. Genuinely, deeply, in the way that you connect with people when you stop managing the connection and just allow it to occur. They told me things about their lives, their fears, their ambitions, their complicated relationships with their own identities and with the expectations that surrounded them, and I listened with the full attention of someone who recognized what they were describing. Consequences. Not, as it turned out, catastrophic consequences. But real ones that I had to think about carefully and honestly. I spoke at length with Dr. Okafor about this. Over 3 sessions that month, we examined the question from multiple directions. She helped me to distinguish between deception, which involves active misrepresentation with the intent to harm or manipulate, and presentation, which involves the selective disclosure of self that every social encounter involves to some degree. She was not letting me off the hook, she was too rigorous for that, but she was helping me to think carefully about what I actually owed people in the contexts I was navigating. And she asked me a question that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. If someone connects with the way you listen, the way you think, the warmth and attention you bring to a conversation, is what they have connected with less real because it was expressed in a presentation you chose rather than one you were assigned? I did not have an answer. I still do not have a complete one. But sitting with that question, month after month, changed something in the way I understood the relationship between the self and its expressions. The self, I was learning, is not a fixed object waiting to be discovered and then displayed. It is a living thing, responsive to context, capable of different expressions in different conditions, and the conditions themselves are part of the story. What had been released in me over these months, the warmth, the directness, the emotional presence, the capacity to be seen and to allow it, was not an invention. It was not a costume. It was something that had always been there, waiting for the specific conditions that would allow it to breathe. The 6th month was, in practical terms, the midpoint of the year. Vivian and I had several conversations that month about trajectory, about where I was in the process, about what I was understanding, about what I wanted. These conversations had a different quality than the ones in the early months. In the early months she had been primarily a guide, asking questions and providing conditions. By month 6 she was also, genuinely, a listener. She was interested in what I was discovering, not as confirmation of a hypothesis she had brought to the arrangement, but as information that was genuinely new. I had expected, I think, that she would have a destination in mind for me, a point at which the year would have achieved whatever she had designed it to achieve, and the discovery that she did not, that she was as genuinely curious about where the process would lead as I was one of the most profoundly affecting realizations of the entire year. I do not have an agenda for who you become, she told me one evening, in her library, the room I had come to associate most closely with the particular quality of her thinking. I have an investment in whether the process is genuine. The outcome is entirely yours to determine. I asked her whether she had ever doubted the arrangement. Whether she had ever thought it was a mistake or that it was doing me harm rather than good. She considered this for a moment, which was her way with questions she took seriously. Then she said, in the 2nd month, when you were struggling with what you called the performance problem, the feeling that you were performing rather than inhabiting, I was concerned that the gap between performance and inhabitation might never close, that you might spend the year feeling like a fraud inside a borrowed life. But it closed. It closed faster than I expected, and more completely. And after that I stopped doubting. Why did it close? I asked. Because, she said, you stopped trying to be someone else and started trying to understand yourself. Those are different projects. The first one is impossible and miserable. The second one is difficult but alive. The second half of the year had a different quality than the first. In the first half I had been learning the skills, the context, the language, the social grammar of a world I had not previously had access to. In the second half, I was applying. I was contributing to the Foundation's work in a meaningful way, helping to develop an outreach program for emerging artists from non-traditional backgrounds, which I understood from the inside in ways that were directly useful. I was building relationships that had depth and continuity. I was, for the first time in my adult life, fully present in my own experience, not managing it from behind glass, not filing the interesting parts away in drawers for later examination, but actually inside it, responding in real time with the full range of what I had to offer. The question of what I would do at the end of the year, who I would be, what I would present, how I would carry forward what the year had given me, was one I had been quietly carrying alongside everything else, and it became more insistent as the months moved toward their end. I did not, it turned out, need to resolve it in advance. The answer came gradually, not as a decision but as an understanding. Say, with as much certainty as I am able to speak with about anything, is that the question of identity, who we are, how we know who we are, what conditions allow us to become more fully ourselves, is not a question with a single answer or a fixed vocabulary or a predetermined destination. It is a question that must be lived, and that requires, more than anything else, the courage to stop managing the answer and start participating in it. In the final weeks of the year I went back to my old apartment, which I had kept at Vivian's insistence, to sit in it and to think. The debt was gone, she had paid it off in month 2, as promised, without ceremony or conditions. The 3 in the morning silence was gone too, replaced by something I can only describe as spaciousness. The apartment looked different to me. Smaller, obviously, I had been living in much larger spaces, but also simpler, and in its simplicity somehow more honest. The evidence of my previous life was all around me, the shelves, the worn furniture, the small accumulation of objects that had constituted the material record of a person who had been surviving rather than living. I did not feel contempt for that person. I felt something much closer to tenderness. He had done what he knew how to do, in the conditions he had been given, and he had kept going, and when an extraordinary and strange and deeply disorienting opportunity had arrived, he had been just frightened enough and just honest enough to say yes. I called Petra that evening. We had been in irregular contact during the year. I had told her I was involved in a professional development arrangement that required some lifestyle changes, which was accurate if incomplete, and she had accepted this in the way that adults who love each other accept things when they sense that the full story will be given when the time is right. She was warm and curious, and when I told her, carefully, some of what the year had actually involved, she was quiet for a long time and then she said, "Are you happy?" I thought about the question with the serious attention it deserved. "I am more myself," I said. "Which is, I think, the thing that was preventing me from being happy." "That's the same thing," she said. I'm not entirely sure she was wrong. The name I use now, the one I mentioned at the beginning, is a synthesis. It is not my birth name and it is not Lena. It is a name that I arrived at over the months following the end of the formal year, through a process of quiet deliberation that I think of as the integration, the work of bringing together what had been separate, the different expressions of the same person, the male history and the female experience and the in-between understanding that had grown from both. I kept what I had developed, the directness, the presence, the emotional availability, the comfort with vulnerability as a form of strength. I updated what had been limited, the self-effacement, the invisibility, the willingness to be useful at the expense of being real. And I released what had never been genuinely mine in the first place, the specific performance of a masculinity that had never quite fit, not because I was something else but because it was a costume I had worn for others' comfort rather than a genuine expression of anything I had actually chosen. I work now with young people navigating identity crises, in a program affiliated with the foundation that Vivian helped me to establish in the year after our arrangement ended. The foundation funds mentoring programs for people between 20 and 30 who are in the specific kind of early adulthood crisis that I know from the inside. Financial instability compounded by identity confusion compounded by the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that no longer, if it ever did, fits. The work is the most meaningful thing I have done, and the meaning is inseparable from the strangeness of how I found my way to it. I speak publicly about the year sometimes, in contexts where the audience is ready for the level of honesty the story requires. I speak about it the way I have spoken about it here, without resolving it into a neater arc than it actually had, without extracting from it a single universal lesson that all people should apply, without claiming that what the experience meant for me is what it must mean for anyone else. I speak about it because I believe that the honest telling of a complicated and improbable and deeply human story is itself a form of contribution. Not to the narrative of identity politics, not to any particular ideology or framework, but to the basic, essential, deeply undervalued project of knowing yourself. Of being willing to look at yourself clearly, without flinching, without the armor of the roles you have been assigned or the identities you have been handed, and to ask, genuinely, with the full weight of the question, who is here? Who is actually here, underneath all of this? What does that person need? What do they have to offer? What are they afraid of, and what is on the other side of that fear? I have found, in asking those questions over and over, in various forms, in various conditions, alone and in conversation, with the fierce and rigorous companionship of people like Vivian and Dr. Okafor and the young artists who trusted me with their own. And has said, in the direct and unsentimental way that is entirely her own, that the only credit she can reasonably take is for the quality of the question she asked me that evening. She asked the question, she will say. I was the one who had to answer it. She is correct about this. And I am grateful for it every single day. There is a young man who comes to our program in the city, I will call him T, because his story is his own to tell in his own time, who arrived 8 months ago at 26 years old, working 2 jobs, carrying debt that had acquired that specific compounding gravity I know from my own experience, with an expression that I recognized immediately because I have worn it myself. The expression of someone who has been managing, competently and without complaint, for so long that they have lost the thread back to whoever they were managing on behalf of. He and I speak regularly. I do not offer him the same arrangement that Vivian offered me. Our program operates differently, with a community of support rather than a single patron, and with far more conventional practical interventions. But in our conversations, I try to offer what was most valuable to me, the quality of attention. The willingness to ask the questions that create the conditions in which honest self-examination can occur. The refusal to project a predetermined answer onto someone else's process. He is beginning, I think, to look at the stranger in his mirror. I can see it in the way he holds a silence now, with more curiosity than fear, more willingness than dread. It is early days. The process is his, entirely, and will go where it goes. But I know what the beginning of that process looks like, and I recognize it in him, and every time I see it I feel something that I can only describe as an ongoing astonishment at the resilience and the complexity and the extraordinary generative potential of a human being who has decided to stop running from themselves and start moving toward. That is the story I wanted to tell you today. Not the story of a man who became a woman, because that is not the story. Not the story of a makeover or a rescue or a dramatic transformation, because those frames are too small for what actually happens when a person genuinely, seriously, courageously undertakes the work of knowing themselves. The story is about debt and fear and silence and an unexpected question asked by a stranger in a marble-floored building. The story is about a drawer that opened on its own and a mirror that held a stranger's gaze. The story is about the specific and irreplaceable education of inhabiting an unfamiliar presentation of the self and discovering that what you find there is not someone else but more of you. The story is about a year that was, in practical terms, arranged for specific purposes, becoming, in human terms, the most formative experience of my adult life, not because of what it added to me but because of what it revealed had always been there, waiting in the specific silence of 3 a.m, waiting for the conditions that would finally make it possible to speak. I do not know who is watching this today, or what specific version of the 3 a.m. silence you might be living in. I do not know what drawer you have quietly stopped thinking about or what stranger is looking back at you from the mirror you have been avoiding. I do not know what question is waiting for you to be ready to hear it. But I believe, not as an abstraction, not as a motivational sentiment, but as something I know from the bone-deep specific experience of having lived it, that the question is there, and that you are more ready to hear it than you currently believe. And that on the other side of the fear that surrounds it is a more complete and more alive version of the person you already are. Thank you for watching, and for spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or someone you love a little better, please feel free to explore more here. These conversations matter. You matter. And the work of knowing yourself, difficult and strange and disorienting as it so often is among the most important work any human being will ever do.